Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the webinar, Toolkit for Safe Speed Limit Setting, New Flexibility under California State Law. I'm Liza Lutzker, a research data analyst with SafeTREC at UC Berkeley, and I've been working on developing this toolkit along with others on this webinar. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping tips that I wanted to go over. So first, this event is being live captioned. Attendees can either enable closed captions in the Zoom interface by clicking the Show Captions option button at the bottom of your screen, or you can use the link that I'm going to paste into the chat to view the captions outside of the Zoom interface. So let me take a moment to put those in there for everybody to see. Okay. We have disabled the chat for the webinar, but there is a Q&A that we will be monitoring. Please use the Q&A button on Zoom to let us know if you're having difficulties or to ask any questions that you may have. Your posted question will be visible to everyone, and folks can upvote those so that we can prioritize questions that apply to more than one person. And we will try to answer as many questions as we can live. We'll have a prolonged Q&A period at the end of the webinar, but please feel free to place your questions into the Q&A at any time. A recording of today's webinar will be posted on the SafeTREC website, and we will email all registrants with a link within a few days once the recording is available. We invite you to revisit the content yourself and to share the link to the recording with your colleagues who may not have been able to join us today. If we won't be posting slides of the presentation, but our registration form did give you the option to request that we send you the slides. If you forgot to check this box when you registered and would like to receive a copy of the slides, please email us at SafeTREC, that's SAFETREC @berkeley.edu. At the end of today's webinar, we'll be sending out a short evaluation form for you to complete. We'd be very appreciative if you take a few minutes to fill this out, as it'll help us to further refine and develop this and other trainings. If you'd like to join the SafeTREC mailing list, we only send out a small number of emails each month, so it's not a huge commitment. You can use the link that I'm dropping in the chat to sign up for that. And finally, we have several polls throughout the webinar, so keep an eye out for those. All right, well, without further ado, we'll get started. I'm going to hand the floor over to Dr. Julia Griswold, SafeTREC's director, to start our presentation today.
Thank you, Liza. So we're really excited about this presentation today. So this is the culmination of a year of work on a Caltrans contract and several years of work that came out of the Zero Traffic Fatalities Task Force. And Rock will talk a little bit more about that in a couple minutes. I'm going to start with just saying a little bit about the webinar agenda. So we're going to begin with a short review of the importance of setting safe speed limits. And then the core of the presentation is talking about federal and state legislation of interest to safe speeds. And then we're going to talk about next steps for jurisdictions interested in lowering speed limits and what you can do to begin that work. And then we're going to have a brief live tour of our Safe Speed Limits Toolkit that was just launched on SafeTREC's website. And then we're leaving about 30 minutes for Q&A. So the purpose of this project is Caltrans partnered or contracted with SafeTREC to develop a guide for understanding the new provisions for safe speed limit setting under AB 43 and AB 1938 in California. And so we've been working with Caltrans. This is called the Safe Speeds T3 project. And we developed, the first T is the toolkit that we'll be talking about later. And then there's training, which is this, and then there's technical assistance. So we worked with 2 cities, one in the Central Valley and one in Southern California, and piloted this training, and then performed some technical assistance to help them understand what they could do on some of their high-speed arterials with safety problems. The motivation for this toolkit, it delineates the key provisions of AB 43 and AB 1938 and their implications for safe speed limit setting by local municipalities. So the intention is for this to be used by practitioners, the general public, advocates, and local elected officials to generate an informed discussion on how to change speed limits on roads within their respective jurisdictions. So we have a brief poll right now.
Okay, so we'd like to know where everybody on this webinar is coming from. We have about 230 participants. And so if you could please go ahead and take a few moments to let us know what kind of organization you work for or represent. If you represent more than one, you can choose more than one, and then take a moment to describe your job function. So we'll give you a few moments to do that. And while you're doing that, I'll just answer the question that was just asked about the manual or resource, and that's actually what the toolkit is. The toolkit should be a pretty comprehensive resource available to folks to update their speed limits with these new flexibilities. Okay, so almost everybody has responded. Just give another couple moments. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results with everybody. So it looks like most folks on here are coming from city governments, with also many from county and state, numerous people from consulting firms and advocacy organizations, not surprising. The majority of you all are engineers. Some others are planners as well as advocates. So it's a great group, and we're really glad to have you all.
All right, so I'm going to introduce Rock Miller, who's going to be presenting the core material for this presentation. We're delighted to have Rock. He's an experienced transportation professional with decades of experience in transportation systems consultancy. He's the CEO of Rock E. Miller Associates. He's a past president of the Institute of Transportation Engineers. He's a former traffic engineer for the city of Costa Mesa, and he was a member of the Zero Traffic Fatalities Task Force. So I'm delighted to pass it off to Rock to continue the presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Julia. I'm happy to be here and like to say hello to everybody out there. And I recognized quite a few names on the sign-up sheet. A special hello to people that know me or I've met before. We're going to be talking, I'll be talking for about a half hour about the importance of setting speed limits, particularly how the thoughts have evolved regarding that subject over the past 10 years. And then we'll talk about how that can be done in California. If you want to go on to the next slide. Probably many of you have seen variations of this slide in the recent past because it's been promulgated quite widely. But basically, as speed goes up, the distance of a car to stop goes up in accordance with how the speed goes up. So the importance of braking and reaction becomes more important the faster the vehicle goes. That would suggest that if we could kindly induce people to travel just a little bit more slowly, we might have some improvements in safety. That's indicated in the next slide. Which basically is also something many of you, I'm sure, have seen recently. It shows the potential for death if you're a pedestrian or anybody involved in a crash, particularly a pedestrian, and it shows that a relatively small reduction, particularly from the 50-mile-an-hour range to the 30-mile-an-hour range, can greatly reduce the potential for severe injuries or deaths from speeding. So again, it would make sense for us to take a close look at the effect of speed and how that might be contributing to casualty problems that the country's been facing lately. Go to the next slide. That'll give you some information on how speed-related injuries have kind of come down in California. You've probably seen this trend in other states or nationally, but you can see we've had a pretty substantial increase in speed-related fatal or serious injury crashes, going up from the 3,500s to a peak of 6,000 a couple years ago. And the green bar at the top indicates that what percentage of all fatal and severe injury crashes involving speed, or going too fast for conditions, or going faster than the posted speed limit. And that runs around 25 to 30%, and it could be higher if we got more information on crash reports. The next slide also shows a little bit more information about speeding, shows that pedestrians have been climbing to become a very high proportion of fatal and serious injuries throughout the state, running in the 40 to 50% range, and bicycling has been climbing originally relatively low percent change, but it's now running 18% of everything. So you can see the speeding problem is particularly acute, particularly in areas where there's a lot of pedestrians and bicycles present. So the next slide kind of asks the question, what is a safe speed? No formal definition for that, but as the slide indicates, it's a velocity at which operators of vehicle can spot roadway objects, including people, come to a stop safely using braking force with a reasonable amount of distance. And we know, as we've seen before, that injury severity is heavily dependent upon the impact speed at the time of the crash. So if you start from a slower speed, you have more time to react. You've got less distance required to bring your vehicle to a stop, and should be safer. As you can see at the bottom, safe speed varies with the type of road you're on, certainly varies with weather, particularly if it's wet or icy. It can take a lot longer to slow and stop. The amount of active transportation or trucks available, and things like construction zones can also affect what is a safe speed. We can really only put one or two numbers on a sign. So the question is, what's the best number to put on the sign? Let's go to that next slide. I want to talk a little bit about the California Vehicle Code. I don't recommend generally reading the vehicle code, but if you're really taking a deep dive into the subject, you need to understand that the vehicle code spreads speeding regulations around multiple sections of the code, and you can never rely on any one section. We'll be talking a little bit through the presentation on CVC 627, which is the definition of an engineering and traffic survey, which is what we need to do to establish speed limits on many streets. Speed laws themselves regarding what you can put on a sign are addressed in 22.348 through 22.366. And CVC in the 40,000s is a section on enforcement. 40802 through 8 are pretty significant to traffic engineers because they indicate that if you do not follow the state laws in setting speed limits, there can be some real difficulties in enforcing them. And if enforcement is difficult, you'll find that the speed limits simply aren't enforced or the tickets get thrown out. Let's go to the next slide. Wanted to start backwards with 40802. That's the section that requires there be an engineering and traffic survey if you're going to use radar enforcement in non-statutory zones. Statutory zones generally are the 25-mile-an-hour residential minimum, the 55-mile maximum on 2-lane roads, the 65-mile-an-hour maximum on 4-lane roads. Anything other than those is a non-statutory limit, and many of those would require an engineering and traffic survey in order to do radar enforcement. If you do not have a survey, or if the survey does not justify the speed limit that's posted, enforcement personnel by law are declared to be incompetent to testify if that survey is not current and valid. Enforcement personnel do not like to be declared incompetent. They do not like to go to court only to see the ticket dismissed because of their incompetency. So as a result, it's pretty wise to make sure that the surveys are current and valid. The section also defines exceptions to the requirement of an engineering and traffic survey. And it also discusses the time limits for extending our surveys, which have been changed by some of the recent legislation. Let's go to the next slide. Relevant manuals that might help you, particularly if you didn't take careful notes or missed something in this presentation. The California Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, which you can find online and was just revised a few weeks ago, has the regulatory framework for the design and implementation of traffic control devices. And it sets forth a lot of information on translating the vehicle code into the requirements of the practitioners to set a speed limit. So if you really want to understand the law of how to do it from your agency perspective, that's where to look. California has a manual for setting speed limits. It's a best practices guide that's published by Caltrans. That document is currently, to my knowledge, as of today, still being undergoing some rewrite and does not yet incorporate some of the changes that became effective at the first of the year. I do believe the current issue will be available within probably weeks, but you'll want to make sure that you're not following a manual for setting speed limits that's dated older than this year or last year, because you will not be following the procedures as they were changed by recent laws. So let's go to the next slide. The Engineering and Traffic Survey is the foundation for setting those non-statutory speed limits. Basically, it does require you to take a survey if you require an engineering and traffic survey to determine how fast cars are driving or all traffic is driving to use the roadway. And that results in the creation of a distribution graph similar to the example on the right side of the slide. You basically, if there's enough traffic there, measure 100 vehicles or more in free flow, identify the speed of the 85th fastest vehicle, and that's your 85th percentile speed. The state law has always indicated how to set your speed limit based upon the 85th percentile. It still in most cases requires you to take an 85th percentile speed survey, but the rules and procedures for setting your speed limit have changed based upon the results of that survey. In general, the prior rule was you had to be closer to the 85th percentile, but with the changes in legislation, in many cases, you can depart further from the 85th percentile so long as you're providing or following the procedures and rules that are currently embedded in the vehicle code. So let's go to the next slide. The 80th percentile, where did that come from? That was something that was developed in the 1960s by a researcher whose last name was Solomon, who generated a study in a curve in which he determined the speed at which drivers were driving compared to the average speed and determined what the potential for collision was based upon the speed they were driving at. And he came up with this red line that showed that the risk of crashes was lowest if you were driving closer to the 90th percentile speed of the street. In other words, if you were driving faster than average, and that the potential for crash was greater if you were driving a lot slower than the average speed. People grabbed this curve and decided that probably setting the speed limit somewhere between the 85th and 90th percentile would get us in that minimal crash history and therefore produce the best possible result. Well, this was based upon rural road speeds. It had probably a lot of flaws in the data that was taken at the time, and it has not really been verified by subsequent research. Also, we know that the speed of turning or soft vehicles may have actually clouded the research. Drivers going slowest, in fact, might have been vehicles that were slowing to turn off the road and really wouldn't have been affected that much by the posted speed limit. So the bottom line is a lot of people, as they became aware that this research was dated and might not be replicable, and have felt that we need to take a closer look at the situation. Let's go to the next slide, which summarizes international experience. Researchers who have analyzed changes in speed limits across the world, particularly in countries similar to the US, have monitored what happens if you do a modest change in speed limit. We do know that a change in the posted speed limit doesn't result in a lot of changes in the average speed of the motor vehicles. And for that reason, many people have suggested it's pointless to reduce speed limits. But researchers have actually concluded that that modest change in average speeds can produce a pretty substantial improvement in injuries and fatalities. The injuries are considered to be a second power of the amount of speed reduction, and the fatal accidents are actually considered to be as much as a fourth power of the speed change. So what that means is if you change the speed by 2%, you can expect the injuries to be reduced by 4%, and you can expect the fatalities to be reduced by 8%. If that average speed reduction goes up even further, those numbers can get pretty dramatic. So the bottom line is we probably should not have been discounting the effect of a 1% change in average speed when we're trying to measure the effect of a speed limit simply by using the speed distribution as the evaluation. Had we been looking at severity of accidents, we probably would have concluded that there is benefit in that 1% loss. Let's go to the next slide. A little bit about federal and state legislation regarding speeds, particularly kind of give you the history of how this has evolved and why the current changes are happening. Let's go to the next slide. I want to talk a little bit about the federal MUTCD. That's a guidance document that states and cities are supposed to follow. It does identify the need for an engineering study. It does indicate speed limits should be in multiples of 5 miles per hour. It gives a little bit of direction regarding how to determine the speed limit based upon the 85th, but they're all guidelines, and there was really no strong obligation to follow them. As we say in the box on the right, California provisions are much more detailed, so you really need to be aware of what the rules are in California. I think there's a little bit more on the federal MUTCD on the next slide as well. A new edition of the federal MUTCD did drop in December of last year. It's less than a month old. That does have modified provisions to consider roadway context, especially in urban areas where the 85th percentile speed may be higher than the desired speed due to the presence of vulnerable users, or it doesn't say it due to the likelihood of crashes based upon the type of road it is. The federal guidelines, again, were largely weakened as far as adhering to the 85th percentile. And that's because there's been a lot of discussion at the federal government level regarding whether or not the 85th percentile truly is the safest speed, and a gradual recognition that it may not be the safest for all roads and for all users. Let's go to the next slide. Oh, a final comment on that federal document. It does not take effect in California until Caltrans has a chance to review it, incorporate state provisions into the federal manual, and that could take up to 2 years. So if you're curious, you can read that new federal manual, but if you're setting speed limits, you must consult with the state manual, which is true generally for any traffic control decision involving our manual on uniform traffic control devices. Now, I want to talk a little bit about California prior to 2009, because actions taken at that time probably are why there became a lot of interest in this subject 10 years or so later. Prior to 2009, you did a speed survey, you got an engineering and traffic survey, and you could round that down to the nearest 5 miles per hour. So if you got 39 miles an hour, you could automatically round down to 35. You could then reduce it by another 5 miles an hour under certain conditions, which were pretty easy to meet. So that 39 miles per hour could often be rounded down to 30 miles per hour based upon the provisions prior to 2009. In other words, you could go 9 miles below the 85th percentile fairly routinely. Things like presence of pedestrians and bicycles were one of the examples of why you could round it down, for example. Well, that round-off rule was changed in 2009, and that had a fairly pronounced effect on speed limit posting as the years proceeded through the following decade. Go to the next figure. From 2009 to 2021, the rule was changed so the speed limit had to be established at the nearest 5 mile per increment, not down to the nearest 5 mile per hour increment. That meant if you got that 30 mile per hour speed, you had to round up to 40 miles per hour. There were still fairly generous 5 mile an hour exceptions, including pedestrian bikes, that got that 39 to 40 and down to 35, but you could no longer round down easily to get from 35 to 30. As a result of that, beginning in 2009, many speed zones slowly but surely were expiring, and the procedure said if you could not renew it, you had to follow the new procedure. Well, you could extend the speed limits up to 10 years, which meant one by one, as the 10-year deadline got closer and closer, more and more speed zones had to be raised by 5 miles an hour because of this change that was enacted in 2009. Well, by around 2021, a lot of groups that were concerned about increasing of speed limits gathered together and said, what can we do about this? We're having to raise speed limits on streets that are turning up in vision zero and high injury networks, and it's really causing us a problem with safety management. So let's go to the next slide. As the 10-year deadline approached, as I said, agencies raised speed limits. Other agencies simply gave up on enforcement and left those lower speed limit zones in place. Political interest increased, as well as the Vision Zero movement. The safe systems programs became popular. And some of the first legislation was introduced around 2020. That was ultimately refined after a year of false starts into AB 43. So, and that was the first bit of legislation to get all the way through the state government process on speed zoning in a decade. Next slide. Let's discuss a little bit further about how AB 43 and its subsequent legislation became in law, the subsequent legislation being AB 1938. Starts with the next slide, which was the establishment of the Zero Traffic Fatalities Task Force. The first version of legislation that looked like AB 43 did not get very far through the legislature, but instead the legislature created a task force to convene stakeholders and other persons together to review what were the problems with speed limits, what would the solutions be, and how would legislation be composed in order to address the problem at hand without creating what some people feared would be a wild west of people establishing speed zones at random, strictly for enforcement purposes. As part of the support to the Zero Traffic Fatalities Task Force, Offer Grambeck, who was a formerly employer here of SafeTREC, did a research synthesis summarizing the scientific literature and the history of the 85th percentile. And his work and others have gotten circulated fairly widely, indicating that the 85th percentile was supposed to be a starting point, not an end all, and it gave some further momentum to the push to do speed limit reform here in California. I was pleased to be invited to participate in the Zero Traffic Fatalities Task Force. Most of the people on the task force were government agencies. I think I was the only one employed by myself at the time. And it gave me kind of the freedom to speak without being colorized by the policy of my employer or others than that. I also probably had a little bit better handle on what the research was showing. And I certainly had a pretty good handle on how the 85th percentile policies were affecting safety and speed limits in the communities I worked in. Let's go to the next slide. AB 43 was signed into law in December 2021, establishing more flexible speed limit setting for municipalities. Caltrans went to work to modify the California MUTCD manual on uniform traffic control devices, for those who don't know the term. And they developed some issues regarding some language in the legislation that could be interpreted one way or another way. And in order to clarify those interpretations, AB 1938 was passed a year later to further clarify the applications. And the net of both packages of legislation was that many of the speed limit procedures were changed as of early this year or even last year, and other changes will become effective in approximately July of this year based upon some work that had to be done by other state departments. Let's go to the next slide. AB 43 basically provides flexibility in speed limit setting for common context sensitive zones. It also extended the validity period of the engineering and traffic surveys now to 14 years. That was done to offset any potential costs of having to do speed limit surveys based upon expiring surveys. You would get an extra few years, which would be a cost savings to agencies. It also exempted certain context-sensitive zones from provisions concerning speed radar enforceability. Specifically, the requirement for engineering and traffic studies was removed, particularly in zones where it was felt and concluded to be impractical to do a survey within the zone, but rather provided guidelines for where you could post a speed limit without doing an engineering traffic survey or survey nearby roads. Let's go to the next slide. So first question I do want to ask you in the poll is, are you aware of whether your agency has increased any speed limits since 2009? We're asking that because if you did so, you may have done it due to the changes in state law that were imposed in 2011, and those speed limits absolutely could be eligible for change based upon changes in the law. So the question again, have you or your agency or any agency you're aware of raised speed limits since 2009? You want to post the questions? That's a poll, right?
No, I think we don't have a poll on that one. That's
Oh,
just
well, you
a
scared
question
me.
for folks to think about.
Sorry about that. Well, definitely something to think about then. AB 43 changes does allow for changes for speed limits to be restored. If you did raise any of those speed limits in the past 10 years, primarily or only because of the change in law and the round off was causing you to raise speed limits that ended in an 8 or a 9 or a 3 or a 4, you now have the ability to restore those speed limits to the levels they were at before, because it basically said you can restore it to an immediately prior speed limit if all other factors are held the same. There was an exception to that. Jurisdictions cannot restore a speed limit that was more than 5 miles an hour below the currently posted speed limit. So again, it's only eligible for a 5 mile an hour change. With that, I'm fairly positive we're into a poll. So question is, a 4-lane local road has a currently posted speed limit of 35 miles an hour. Previous posted speed limit was 30 miles per hour, but it had to be changed when the 85th percentile from the last engineering and traffic survey was measured at 32.8 miles an hour. The city engineer performed a new survey because the old one was expiring and found a new 85th percentile of 37.5 miles per hour, which would round up to 40 miles per hour. And that value seemed to be concerningly high to the official and probably to the political body that he would have to report that to. So the question is, what is the lowest speed limit can be established on this roadway at this time based upon the current engineering and traffic survey of 37.5 miles per hour? Your choices are 25, 30, 35, and 40. Go ahead and vote. Okay, when it looks like the voting is stabilized, we can reveal the results and see what the group thinks is right. All right. The lowest speed limit, we had a lot of people that said 30 miles an hour. We had a lot of people that said 35 miles an hour. The 37.5 would round up to 40. It would be easy to get it down to 35. It would have to meet some special criteria to get down to below 35 miles an hour. Do we have the official answer to the question?
Yeah, so the official answer, do you want to say it right, is that it would be 30 miles an hour.
It's 30 miles an hour based upon the procedures that are available for reducing speed limits at this time. All right.
And that's because of the restoring
Yes.
of the previously posted speed limit.
Right. Okay. Trying to, the close button works better than the X button. Let's go to the next section. Again, highlighting some of the changes of AB 43. Existing law did specify speed limit could be valid for 7 years if enforcement met training requirements. It could be extended to 10 years if the registered engineer determines there had been no significant change in the roadway. A significant change being defined as something would have been expected to change the use of a roadway, such as a widening, development, or something that basically makes it a different road than it was when the survey happened. And then AB 43, as I've indicated before, allows the engineer to now extend the survey up to 14 years. So if your agency has surveys that are about to become 10 years old, you can extend them to 14 years, but you probably have to file a notice to the court to say that the surveys are less than 14 years old. Let's go to the next slide. AB 43 created a new prima facie speed limit category. Prima facie is the default speed limit on a roadway. Existing law had established a number of prima facie speed limits for local jurisdictions, which included business district or residential district, senior zone, school zone, playground zone, alley or obstructed view rail crossing, Most of them were 25 miles an hour, but there was an option to do a 15-mile-an-hour zone within schools. These prima facie zones often resulted in the roadway being exempt from an engineering and traffic survey, either during the time that the school is in use or for other purposes. Some required posting, some did not require posting, but these help to define the streets in which you didn't have to do the engineering and traffic survey. AB 43 added to this list, and I believe the ads are in the next slide. Oh, well, I guess we have poll 3 and 4 first. Local police department decided how to allocate resources for speed enforcement and are considering enforcement on a collector road that does not have a prima facie speed limit. The engineering traffic survey that was used to establish the speed limit on the road was 12 years ago. It was evaluated by a registered engineer. Should the police department assign officers to perform speed enforcement on this road? Again, engineering traffic survey is 12 years old, and they are concerned with resources. Can they do speed enforcement? Probably ready to review the answer. Well, I believe we all got it right that time, except me. I wasn't allowed to vote according to the software. But yes, the police can use this road for justifiable speed limits because the validity was extended to 14 years. But that does require that there be no significant changes in the roadway and that no substantial changes in traffic conditions have occurred, largely based upon property or land use, roadway width, or a substantial increase in traffic volume. Substantial increase has not really been defined, but if it's only a little bit of annual growth that you get every year, that's generally not considered a substantial increase. If you closed a parallel road and had it go up 30–40%, that would be considered a substantial increase, at least to me. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, local municipality is hearing complaints about speeds on an arterial with many retail shops and restaurants. The road currently has a speed limit of 25 miles per hour. What speed limit might be allowed on this road? Your choices are 15, 20, 25, or 30. Shall we reveal the voting? Well, a lot of you have done your homework. We didn't tell you about the business activity district added to the vehicle code yet, but still a substantial number of voters are aware of the fact that there is a new category exempt from engineering and traffic survey called a business activity district. And that allows you to post 20 miles an hour or 25 miles an hour within what's essentially downtown streets that have typically parking on both sides, a lot of traffic controls, and the separation between traffic controls is such that it's really impossible to do an engineering and traffic survey. So let's go to the next slide where we'll probably talk a little bit more about that. Basically, following an NTETS, cases in which the speed limit need to be rounded up. Instead, they can be rounded down to the nearest 5-mile increment. And if you've already rounded it down, you can still take the 5-mile-an-hour reduction for roadside conditions not apparently apparent to the driver. So again, a 35 can be rounded to 35, and it can be down to 30 for the roadside changes. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, after you've done the ETS, if your speed limit is determined still to be higher than is safe, you can lower it by an additional 5 miles an hour if the corridor is considered to be a safety corridor which may require some kind of action or designation if it has a rate of fatal or serious injury crashes, or if the road has a high concentration of pedestrians or bicyclists, or a high rate of pedestrian or bicycle crashes. You can plan for these changes based upon it being a safety corridor or having a high likelihood of crash now, but it may not be possible to do enforcement of these roads until after June 30, 2024. And the reason for this is there was a lot of sensitivity when these laws were being changed that the reduction in speed limits could be considered a hardship to people that did not have the financial wherewithal to fight or pay the fines. As a result of that, the California Judicial Council is currently taking a look at how fine structures should be modified for people that have limited income and ability to pay high fines. That's not expected to be finished till June 2024, and we'll have to see if that's ready to go forward by June 2024. Also, some of the procedures for identifying the high injury network or the safety corridor are being refined at the same time. Let's go to the next slide. It looks like we're up to polls 5 to 6 now. We can display question 5. Local roadway has experienced a significant number of serious motor vehicle crashes involving bicycles over the few years. A recent engineering and traffic survey identified the 80th percentile speed to be 49.9 miles per hour. To best protect vulnerable users, what is the lowest speed limit that can be set by the agency? The choices are 35, 40, 45, or 50. Ready to show the answer?
Just going to let a few people finish.
All right. The answer most people got right. The lowest speed limit you could set at that road would be 40 miles per hour. That would amount to a 9.9 mile per hour reduction from the 85th percentile. You get there by rounding down to 45, as opposed to the 50 that previous legislation would have required. Once you're at 45, you can take another 5 mile an hour reduction due to the high pedestrian or bicycle volume. Also, if it was in the top 20% hotspot for bicyclist fatalities or injuries. Again, there may be a little cloud about this before June or July, but in most agencies, if you haven't thought about this much until today, you'd probably be hard pressed to get the speed limit changed before June or July, unless you're particularly pushed to do this by your agency. Now let's go to question 6. A local jurisdiction is concerned about the current posted speed limit on a roadway. There have been few serious fatal or serious injury crashes and few bicyclists or pedestrians present. There are utility poles carrying electrical wires along the roadway, and the incline on a certain section of the highway is very severe. I think incline is the same as super elevation by our reference. So anyway, driver's sight distance is limited significantly. If the 85th percentile speed turns out to be 37.4, what is the lowest speed limit that can be set on this roadway? Choices are 25, 30, 35, and 40. We got most people voted that the lowest speed limit was 30, and the answer is the lowest speed limit is 30. That provides for a total 7.4 mile an hour reduction. First by rounding down to 35, the nearest 5 mile an hour increment, and then by reducing by another 5 for unsafe conditions created by the sight distance limitations and the close proximity to the utility poles. Now, what's interesting to note is if that 85th percentile was 0.1 mile an hour higher, you could not round down at first. You would actually have to round up to 40 miles per hour. You could then reduce by 5 miles an hour for the local conditions to get to 35 miles an hour. So the result of the 85th percentile survey was pretty sensitive to determine what you could do on that road. Now, if the road at 37.4 miles an hour is a safety issue, you could actually set it to 25 miles an hour for a 12.4 mile an hour reduction. That's important because when we get to the companion legislation, that officially set a floor of 12.4 miles an hour as the lowest speed you could post on a sign based upon the 85th percentile for any condition. You get there by rounding down to 35, then reduce another 5 for the unsafe road conditions and another 5 for the safety corridor, gets you to 12.4. Again, if it's 0.1 mile an hour higher, 37.5, you lose 5 of those miles per hour, but you can still get it down to 30 miles an hour. So the microscopic result of your surveys when they're very close to 0.5 can matter. I have no idea what would happen if you moved your survey location a couple hundred feet, but you might get 0.1 lower, you might get 0.1 higher, you might get the same value. It's anybody's guess. But as you can see, those surveys really close to 0.4, 0.5 can really matter in this case. Let's go to the next slide. So now is perhaps the time to plan for 5 mile an hour reductions on the basis of safety or vulnerable road users. You may not be able to do all this until after June 30th, but I believe if you start planning now, you can pretty much get your ducks in order and determine what streets would be eligible for it and initiate the procedures to get that speed limit through your city council or your board of supervisors or whatever your supervisory chain is. I might add, I know there's some people from Caltrans watching. The procedures that we're talking about generally apply to cities and counties. You'll have to do a reading of the procedures to see how it applies to state highways. Some may be eligible, some may not be eligible, but I know most of the people here either represent cities and counties or work for consulting firms that probably do these surveys for cities and counties. And again, if you have a consultant do this work and you haven't even sent out an RFP yet, it's probably you're not going to have results back until after June 30th, and you'll be able to proceed accordingly. I do recommend that you go back to the other slide for a second. I do recommend that you work with your city council to make sure, number one, they're comfortable with what you're doing. There are city councils out there that do seem to be comfortable with speed limits where they are and are not interested in reducing them. Other city councils may see it differently, and I wouldn't recommend you present a program to the city council to reduce a large number of speed limits if they were not already expecting it. And again, you should also allow time to order materials and to place work orders to get the signs actually imposed. Final note, during the first 30 days that lower speed limits are in effect, and if the speed limit is exceeded by 10 miles an hour or less, the law says only warning citations can be issued. So you want to make sure your enforcement personnel are aware of that as well. So next slide. I want to talk a little bit about defining a safety corridor or a high injury network. Most cities that have done this have found a large proportion of their crashes do occur along a relatively small proportion of their networks. As a result, these corridors with their high crash importance probably are the corridors that are most likely to be eligible for the lowest potential reductions in speed limits. If you've already done a local road safety plan, it probably has identified your corridors and is probably a good starting point for you. Your network can't exceed a certain percentage of all your roadways, being 20%, but most of these networks are quite a bit smaller than the total network of the roadway. So it's a good place to start. And you can weigh it by crash severity. You can weigh it by the mode of user, vulnerable population, or other things to come up with your network. A lot of agencies don't like to define high injury network formally, but they can probably find a way to justify the speed limits based upon a localized analysis and a report in your engineering and traffic survey. Go to the next slide. A little bit about AB 1938. It basically clarified what was perceived as loopholes or vagueness in AB 43. 1938 makes it pretty clear that any adopted speed limit requiring an engineering and traffic survey may not be reduced by more than 12.4 miles per hour below the measured 85th percentile speed. Again, that example we had a few minutes ago, our 37.4 miles an hour could be reduced by 12.4 miles per hour, but the 37.5 miles an hour could not, because the reduction would have been more than 12.4. So that's kind of your magic number. That's the lowest you can get at. You'll still have to research to see if you can get there. But if you've got an 85th and you subtract 12.4 from that, and you're still at a high number, you still really have little flexibility other than to give up on enforcement if you choose to do it the speed limit lowering. Let's go to the next section, next slide. With that, I like to go into the next steps for jurisdictions. I know we were going to hand off. I've lost track of where we're going to hand off, but let's go to the next slide. And Julia, I can't remember, were you jumping in now?
Nope, this is still you.
Okay, good, me, no problem. I can't, oh yeah. Anyway, next step, you'll want to gather your current citywide engineering and traffic survey. If you've got an older one, particularly that was completed between 2009 and 2018, you can probably see at a glance which speed limits in your city were raised, and can probably determine if they were raised not because of a change in the roadway, but because of a change in the prior law. You also want to start with the California Road System Functional Classification Maps. These are maintained by Caltrans. You can find them at the state website pretty easily by Googling that term. I do want to mention another change in the laws, however. It used to say that there was a definition for residential commercial road, which was secondary to the California Functional Classification, and there has been a change. Now you can use either the functional classification or the description of the road. It indicates the number of houses within a quarter-mile interval and things like that to define it as residential. Many communities have roadways that seem like they should not be on a functional classification system. Two-lane residential streets, the parking allowed on both sides, and houses on both sides. Those roads may now be exempt from an engineering and traffic survey that were not exempt before, so you want to look for those. You'll also probably want to look at details on your capital improvement program, look for any funded safety improvements. If you have a HSIP project on a roadway, a Safe Routes to School project coming up, or something else that might change the road, you want to be aware of that. Also, you'll want to look for mapping of fatal and serious injuries in your jurisdiction. You can get that if you've already got a Vision Zero type high injury network map, or you've completed a local road safety plan, or if you've done a systemic safety analysis report in the past few years, SSARP program. Also, if you're not familiar with UC Berkeley's transportation injury mapping system, that system allows you to generate a map showing injury collisions and also the collision severity level for your community, just with a few keystrokes on the internet. It'll take you a little while to master the system. If you've already got a computerized system of your own, you may not need to do that. But when we were doing this project for a few communities as pilots, we were able to generate collision maps for those communities using these systems, and pretty easily at a glance identify the locations where there were basically a lot of dots that suggested that the collision history was significant at those locations. So if you want to go to the next slide. So again, if you have a Vision Zero action plan, you may already have a network. If you've already created a local road safety plan, you may have a network. If you have any other documents, plans, analysis of roadways with recommended speed limits, you may be able to do that. But again, is reducing speed limits consistent with your city's stated goals, plans, or perspectives of your city council or your board of supervisors? And are there any pending council or city manager requests to review speed limits at specific sites? Among the questions you might want to ask are, it's cut off on my screen. Lowering the speed limit on a roadway. I can't read the bottom of my slide, help. Yeah, it's cut off on my example too. All I can read is
it says, Rocket says embarking on a new citywide ENTS and considering lowering the speed limit on a specific roadway.
Yeah. Yeah, and some presentation graphics are hiding the word considering, so I panicked. Let's go to the next slide, where the same words also hide the bottom line, but I brought up my version. So anyway, for each segment in your engineering and traffic survey, ask yourself, is the posted speed limit higher than it needs to be for safety? One thing we found in looking at this for a few pilot cities is that often they had very long speed zones which addressed a very large number of different types of roadway. And they found that if you had a 3 or 4 mile speed limit, there might be areas that needed to have the high limit that was posted for the whole corridor. Others were more frequent traffic signals, more frequent land uses that generated interference and resulted in probably a lower measurement. And by doing a speed survey in more segments, it became possible to identify those roads that needed the highest speed limit that the old system might have indicated. But by strategically taking more surveys, you were able to identify other sections where there might have been concern and raise the speed limits in those sections. So you had overall a network in which your engineering and traffic surveys were more closely tailored to your segments and allowed you to have speed limits that perhaps more sensitive to the lower questions. So again, we come back to, did you raise any speed limits in 2019 and 2018? And again, do you have any corridors that would qualify as a business activity district? Again, that's a area that's probably no more than 4 lanes. It's generally got business activity that generates pedestrian or bicycle activity, buildings with frontage pretty close to the sidewalk, parallel or diagonal or head-in parking along the roadway, and also either frequent traffic controls or frequent marked uncontrolled crosswalks. Basically, if you have those, it kind of looks like either an old town village or a downtown. You do not need the engineering traffic survey there, and you can go as low as 20 miles an hour. I don't know if anybody from San Francisco is watching this, but I know San Francisco did post 20 miles an hour on many of their commercial corridors within months after it became possible to do so. And I have a few pictures somewhere of the 20-mile-an-hour signs on the signal mast arms on those streets. So again, are you embarking on a new citywide engineering traffic survey, or are you considering lowering the speed limit on any roadway? You want to review this pretty carefully and see what the right way to go is. Let's go to the next slide. And I think I believe this is the official transfer to Julie. Did I get it right that time?
Yes, thank you, Rock.
All right.
So I'm very conscious of time and wanting to leave plenty of time to address questions. So we're going to move. The next step is to do a brief live demo of the toolkit. So the toolkit, it has been launched on SafeTREC's website. I think it's not showing up in Google searches yet, but we'll be sharing the link in the chat and broadly through other venues. But if you go to safetrec.berkeley.edu, it's under Tools and California Safe Speeds Toolkit. So this is the main page of the toolkit, and there are 7 sections. And so the 4 on the right are generally structured similarly to this presentation. And then the 3, did I say right or left? So the 4 on the left are generally structured the way this workshop was. And then the 3 on the right are references, including acronyms and glossary of terms, in case you're not familiar with some of them. So the first section, this is really a summary of the research synthesis that was conducted by UCITS, that's the Grembeck et al. Research synthesis that was developed in support of the Zero Traffic Fatalities Task Force. So we go over a lot of the research demonstrating issues with the 85th percentile speed limit and the importance of setting safe speed limits. And so the other sections, I think the most important for most folks, so the current speed limits, our speed setting law, that's going to go over a lot of the minute changes in the legislation based on AB 43 and AB 1938, but we really like this next step section, which summarizes everything really nicely. So we developed a flow chart so you can follow through the logic and see what speed limits might be appropriate, whether an ENTS is necessary, and how much you can reduce your speed limits below the 85th percentile speed. This is also summarized in words for greater accessibility. And then we have a summary of the questions for local jurisdictions to consider in how to approach lowering speed limits or changing their speed limits, materials that would be useful to collect for speed zones, and other sections here. So I don't want to spend too much time on this because we are running out of time. And so I'm going to really quickly go through these slides again. This is something we mentioned at the very beginning, that we intend this toolkit to be useful for many parties, primarily staff in public works and engineering roles, so that they can know how to reduce their speed limits on roads based on these new flexibility. Governing leaders, help them understand how to speak to the public about these issues and how to make informed decisions. Consultants who are supporting cities and conducting ENTS studies, and advocates in the general public, so they know how to speak to public leaders and staff and advocate for safer speeds on their local roads. Here's some contact info for folks who were involved in this study if you have follow-up questions. So first we have Rock Miller, who is our presenter today. From Caltrans, we have Robert McNew, who is an expert with many years of experience on speed limit setting. Victoria Custodio was our contact with the California Department of Public Health and the Active Transportation Resource Center. And then there is contact info for myself and Liza, who were the leads on this project for SafeTREC. So I'm going to pass it off to, I think, Liza to start sharing some of the questions.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Julia, and thanks, Rock, for that. We have a number of questions. Everybody can see the questions, and I'm going to just start with the questions that have the largest number of upvotes. So if you see another question that you want answered, go ahead and upvote it, because that's how we're going to kind of triage these with the time we have left. Okay, Rock, I'm going to read the first one. Setting a posted speed limit. Oh, these are all moving around now as people upvote. Okay, setting a posted speed limit 12.4 miles an hour below the 85th really means more than half the drivers could be vulnerable to a ticket. Without any roadway modifications, this could end up with a lot of pushback regardless of council support. Police departments also need to be aware of this law, as do traffic courts. It's not really a question, but I don't know if you're willing, if you're able to kind of address that.
Yeah. Regarding this and other questions, most agencies won't enforce anything until you're going 10 miles an hour over the speed limit. So although technically you could cite a lot of percentage of drivers, I think you're still going to see that only the fastest driver that the officer sees in the 15 to 30 minutes they're waiting to issue the ticket is going to be affected by this. And I answered a question that was near the top beforehand. This is still, the committee and the task force had input in this, but it still is ultimately what the legislature decided to do based upon all the information that was presented to them. I believe they continue to be concerned that there can be abuse of speed zones, speed traps, revenue generating, and things like that. And they really wanted there to be a very close relationship between the ability to reduce speeds further and vulnerable users and existing safety problems. And it's probably a work in motion. I've heard many people say they wish there were more statutory speed limits. I think eventually we may get there. We did get there with our business activity district, but we've still got some distance to go to get others in. Want to go to another question?
Yeah, sure. So do you have a recommendation on how soon after a road reconfiguration project, like a road diet or other changes in lane width, how soon after that an ENTS should be performed to get an accurate reflection of driver behavior? Does 6 months seem an appropriate amount of time to allow traffic to get back to normal?
I would say it's an interesting research question. If the theory that drivers respond to the presence of the road in front of them and establish their speeds, you should see a significant change the day the road diet's implemented. But I would probably wait at least 30 days before I would take a survey. But it would be interesting to see if there was any trend in further reduction between the opening day and the 6-month duration.
Great. Okay. So here's a question about bicycling to and from schools, although I think it probably just applies to school zones in general. How close do you have to be to the school to reduce the speed limits with the prima facie zone?
Yeah, that's
and the question was within a mile.
Yeah,
but
yeah, that's pretty clearly defined in the state law regarding school zones. And school zones do not require an engineering and traffic survey. So you basically need to go to the chapter, it's chapter 7 of the MUTCD, tells you where you can put the 25-mile-an-hour signs and also gives you the criteria in which you can reduce the speed zone to 20 or 15, which is a function of the speed limit on the roadway before they get to the school zone.
So that,
but yeah, go ahead.
That is also described in the toolkit in the section on school zones. So it looks like for the 15-mile-per-hour school zone speed limit, that can be up to 500 feet from school grounds, but it also has to be in a residential district. For the extended 25-mile-per-hour school zone, that is 500 feet to 1,000 feet from school grounds. And then there's also issues with the what the speeds are outside that zone.
Great. The next question we have is SafeTREC states that a 5-mile-an-hour reduction is likely to increase speed with stronger enforcement, which isn't always possible due to police resources. Another link talks about posting lower speed limits and reduces the speed of the fastest drivers. I haven't seen a lot of formal studies on this, but people have done before and after studies with reductions in speed limits. Although they never saw usually much more than a 1% to 2% reduction in average, people have almost always seen a substantial reduction in the speed and the number of drivers going 10 miles an hour over the speed limit. Just as most enforcement practices seem to be, we don't ticket anybody until they're going 10 miles an hour over. Most drivers seem to perceive that if they drive within 10 miles an hour of the new or old posted speed limit, they're not likely to get a ticket. As a result of that, we do see dramatic changes in the speeds of people going 10 miles an hour faster than the posted speed limit. And those are the people driving at the speeds that are most likely to cause fatal or severe injuries. As a result, the studies and research have indicated this action should reduce the potential for fatal and serious injuries on roads that experience the most fatal and serious injuries. Looks like the next
is a great one. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, looks like the next question is about lowering speed limits on state highways. If you feel that your state highway is eligible, I would encourage you to approach your representative at Caltrans to see if their interpretation or the rules for state highways work for them. I'm not quite as clear. I believe some of them definitely can apply to state highways, but others may not be able to. And it's really going to be a case-by-case basis for you. I believe many of the provisions are possible, but I'm not sure that some of the ones that get that additional 5 miles an hour are possible. Okay, the next question is, how can engineering of the road induce lower speed limits? Again, the speed limit signs themselves might have a mile an hour or two effect. Things like electronic advisory, your speed signs can also have a significant effect, maybe another mile an hour or two. Long-term things like medians, trees, narrowing of lanes, things like that. And there's a growing body of research, and I think maybe the toolkit can talk about some of the techniques that are done. To get a really substantial change, you'll probably need to do a change in behavior. There was another change in the legislation we haven't talked about, but 5 or 6 cities have been given permission to use automated speed enforcement. There are a lot of rules and regulations over how that's been done, but it is also going to be targeted to these same high injury networks. And we may have a lot more information on whether targeting speed limit reductions to high injury networks has a more dramatic effect than just lowering speed limits on roads in general without safety problems. So we still got a lot of work in front of us. The world was constructed the way the world was constructed. I think there's a pretty clear understanding that speeds are too high. But the first step has really been, rather than legislating to legalize the high speeds, to take a look at where we really should find ways to induce them to be reduced.
And I just want to call attention to, Rock, something you presented earlier, which is that even a modest reduction in speeds can have, because of the exponential nature between speed and crash severity, can have a very small change in speed limit, can also have pretty major health impacts.
Right. The next most popular question asks if the speed of bicycles on a road should be included in the data in the speed survey. Most roads, bicycles are no more than 1% or 2% of the flow. I'm not sure they'll make a difference. If you're on a roadway with a lot of bicycles, you would certainly qualify under the high presence of bicycles and pedestrians. I don't know that the process as it's written allows you to time the speed of 100 bicycles and set the speed accordingly. I would suggest you read through it closely and see what you can do. I do believe you'll find you can reduce speed limits on roads because there's a lot of bicycles, and that probably would accomplish the same thing as including 1 or 2 bicycles in your survey. The next question, I think, is also relates to making it safer for walking and biking. I believe, again, as I said before, the changes do allow for greater sensitivity to walking and biking. They certainly allow greater sensitivity to the larger goal of posting lower speed limits where possible, and they certainly provide more opportunities to do that where bicycles and pedestrians are. I'm sure that over the next decade, we'll be taking a close look at this and see if additional measures are appropriate. The next question is facility that generates high concentrations of bicycles or pedestrians. That is something that I expect to appear in the revised Caltrans manual for setting of speed limits. It will provide some information on what does define a concentration of high pedestrians or bicyclists to get below 5 miles an hour. And I think one of the reasons why we can't really take advantage of that opportunity till July is because Caltrans is continuing to work on incorporating legislative changes into the state MUTCD, which is the document that the practitioners are supposed to follow. Julia, you're going to this flow chart. Does that have the answer?
Yeah, so in the toolkit under the current speed setting law, section 5 has information on land or facility that generates high concentrations of bicyclists or pedestrians. So that does have additional information on that topic.
Great. I believe the answer of parks is the next most popular question. I believe that was answered by what Julia just showed you. Park would be considered, in my judgment, area with a high presence of pedestrians and bikes. Next question after that is, it just jumped. Caltrans recently released a traffic calming guide, which can be accessed. I think that's suggested to be an answer to a question as opposed to a question, but there's a link now to get to Caltrans's traffic calming guide. The next question is, can we confirm that local roads that appear on the state map are 25 miles an hour per 22.352? The answer is the legislation officially said either on the map or meeting these requirements, while the older version said on the map, and if the maps are not available, meeting these requirements. So absolutely, it has to qualify for the 25 miles an hour per the residential design, which indicated a maximum width of the road, a maximum length between traffic control devices, and a requirement for residential frontage. So put it through that test and conclude for yourself. But I would definitely recommend that you update your engineering and traffic survey to include that road and indicate that it is a residential zone per the provisions of the vehicle code that define residential zones. If it's not on your survey, you probably are asking for trouble, because the survey is where the enforcement personnel and the traffic court judges really start to learn what the new procedure is.
Hi, Rock, I think you've gone to the most recent as opposed to the most up votes now somehow,
Yeah.
I think.
Okay.
Do you want me to read the most
Oh,
upvoted
I
ones?
haven't been scanning to the top. That's what I've been doing.
No problem.
If a road only partly falls into the safety corridor network, is the entire segment of it eligible for a 5 mile an hour reduction, or only the portion overlaps with the safety network? Generally speaking, the vehicle kind of encourages 1 mile an hour segments for speed zones. It's encouragement, it's not a mandate. I would generally probably not do a speed zone any shorter than a half mile unless there was a really substantial change. But absolutely, I would use the safety corridor network to define where the speed limit could be changed. You could expand it probably a little bit beyond that network, but you would not be able to extend it if it's a very long road. As we've said before, we are encouraging people to look at whether their longer speed zones can be chopped into shorter speed zones, where an additional engineering and traffic survey would produce a different result for the busier and more safety prone network. Okay, yeah, I wasn't seeing them scan, so as people vote, the most popular question tends to flow to a different place. We have residential streets that historically and currently are 30 to 35 miles an hour, so we cannot restore to the previous speed limit. Can we use the prima facie for residential as our justification? The answer is probably yes, if they meet the residential street requirement, which I was describing before. Provides for a minimum of houses within short distances, maximum width of the street, maximum distance between traffic control devices. And absolutely, if they're not on the state system maps, many cities were maintaining higher speed limits simply because they were there before. But the law is pretty clear. If you meet the residential zone requirement now, you're probably eligible for lower speed limits. But again, I recommend you document this in the surveys you turn into the court. Next most popular question. Are there links or research that show the lowering of speed limit on the sign slows itself in California? The links on SafeTREC are to Sweden, which has a different geographic infrastructure. Most surveys I've seen show a 1 to 2 mile an hour reduction for a 5 mile an hour reduction in speeds. Most researchers that have looked at the effect of that reduction is coming because we're seeing substantial reaction in the highest speeds. As I've said before, if you're already driving below the 50th percentile, why would you change speeds if the speed limit changes? There's really no reason to expect everybody to drive 5 miles an hour slower because the speed limit is lower. What we would expect is the vehicles that are speeding would drive at a 5 mile an hour lower speed. As a result of that, most people aren't affected. People driving the fastest are affected. And I'm seeing more and more surveys that are verifying this. Some of the most recent surveys are coming out of, to name a few cities, Seattle and Portland. They did speed limit reductions in large portions of the area, immediately saw dramatic reductions. I believe Boston has done this as well. And I'm sure we're going to see a lot of cities in California reporting the results in the next 6 to 12 months as we roll this program out and more cities do it.
I think there is a useful report to look at on this topic with 1 or 2 cases that match this outside of California. So Fair and Peers did a case studies report for Caltrans. and I can't share the link while my screen is shared, but it's called Safe System Approach to Setting Speed Limits, Case Studies Report or something like that. So you can Google that and find their report to Caltrans on that topic that looks at the effects of lowering speed limits in other states, and including just signage.
All right, the next question to the top, do we have data regarding setting speed limit artificially low and impacts to safety? Meaning a speed limit is set below what is allowed by the engineering traffic survey. Does that give the public a false sense of safety based upon the posted speed limit where vehicles are driving much faster? I know the program in California is based upon lowering speed limits for streets that do have safety problems. If you lower the speed limit on a street that doesn't have safety problems, it would be hard to expect an improvement in safety on those streets. It's possible you could see an increase in safety, but I haven't seen a lot of research on that. What I've definitely seen is a lot of cities with 3 and 4 mile long speed limits, including busy commercial areas that probably have safety issues, and relatively access limited areas with limited driveways and intersections, and no shopping centers that do not have safety issues. I believe what we'll find with this program is that the speed limits do tend to be reduced in the areas that have the greater commercial activity, because they will fall within the high injury network. But we'll really have to see how it works out. I might add that there is a need to report back to the legislature of this overall program after, I believe, 5 years. So we'll call it a 5-year experiment, but we're all hoping we will see substantial improvements in a problem that's clearly been getting worse each year. And the inability to adjust speed limits has probably limited the ability to respond to those growing problems. The next most popular question is, can radar speed data be collected now if speed limits cannot be changed and posted till 7/1/24? The answer is yes, you can collect the radar now to see if the radar is still valid. How old can the radar data be if we were to change the speed limits? I'm not sure I understand the details, but the radar would have to be collected within that 14-year expiration. So if your radar data is more than 14 years old, you'll probably have to recollect the data. If your radar is less than 14 years old, you certainly can maintain your speed limit. You might be able to reduce it based upon simply the changes in round off. So you want to take a look at that. But the process still requires us to collect radar to know what the basis for speed limit setting is on non-statutory zones. And then it says procedurally how you go once you have the 85th percentile. The next most popular question is, can I speak to the importance of proper planning and project needs to actually make drivers reduce their speeds? One thing to post a number on a sign, another, there needs to be a reason to slow down. I think I've kind of hinted on this before. I do feel strongly, and one of the motivations that got the legislature to do this was the tendency to measure speeds at the fastest place on the road and post those speeds for long distances away from that fastest point. I believe we feel that taking a look at more of a segment by segment basis rather than a 3-mile road and a 3-mile speed limit will produce some results. I see speed limits that I think are reasonable when there's no signal for a half a mile. And I see that same speed limit posted through a commercial district simply because they couldn't survey it in the commercial district. We'll really have to see what's happening, but I believe in the end, we're going to see much more sensitivity to safety. And I want to believe that motorists will understand the reason why the speed limit just got reduced when the intensity of commercial use got higher, and will slow appropriately. And we will survey there and find that we do not have the disregard for speed limits that we might have had otherwise. Next question. If we were lowering almost 15 miles per hour below the 85th, what is making people actually drive that slow? I think we've already answered that question kind of before. Also, there's nothing that allows it to be reduced to 15. The floor is 12.4, which means realistically it's closer to 10. Next question, can I speak to the importance of proper planning and projects needed to actually make your drivers reduce their speeds? One thing to post on a sign. I know the toolkit goes into a lot of things that can be done to reduce speeds. I know that roadway geometry, narrowing lanes is important. Constructing maze medians can be important. If you've got a road with a half-mile gap between traffic signals, you're putting a third signal in between because of problems at the location of the signal, you might find it meets the safety criteria, and you might find that the speed within that cluster of speed of signals within half a mile makes a difference in speeds. So it's really a case of is your speed limit representative of the road where it's being posted, or is it representative of a faster piece of road a mile away? What role can marking crosswalks play in reducing speed limits? I think it can have a substantial role, but you need to be aware of the provisions and the growing concerns for safety at marked uncontrolled crosswalks. If you unilaterally decide to mark crosswalks, you may find you're creating a situation where you need to put some kind of electronic device or other criteria with the crosswalk to meet the requirements of the MUTCD. If your crosswalks do qualify and that allows you to measure reduced speeds or declare something to be a commercial activity district, it will be there for you. But again, marked crosswalks still have concerns, especially on roads with higher volumes, higher speeds, and multiple lanes. And you may end up buying additional traffic signals, additional hybrid beacons, or rectangular rapid flashing beacons, all the things that have been added to the MUTCD over the last 10 years.
So it's 11 o'clock, so we're going to have to stop the questions there, but a lot of these questions are answered in the toolkit and we hope we'll use it. Again, I'm going to drop into the chat the link to sign up for the SafeTREC newsletter, as well as the link to the Safe Speeds Toolkit. You'll all also be getting an evaluation when you close this. That also has a link to the toolkit, and we'd really appreciate if you would fill that out. I want to thank both Dr. Julia Griswold and Rock Miller for joining us today, and thank you all for coming. We hope it's been helpful. Thanks so much.
Yeah, if I'm emailed questions, they won't be answered within 5 minutes, but I'm usually more than willing to answer questions by email. And my email is rock@rockemiller.com. And again, I welcome your input. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.